A wide sky, two suns rising over a city of pale stone spirals that seem to grow out of the ground rather than stand upon it. The camera drifts down, through mist, past towers older than any human word for old, toward one small window, high in the east wing of a palace. Inside that window, a young woman with hair like gold pulled from a slower kind of loom, 24 years old, standing very still, alone in a room built for 100 people to speak in, and nobody is speaking. Somewhere below, a corridor, boots on marble, the measured stride of a man who does not need to hurry, silver braid down his back, eyes the color of iron already cooled. He turns a corner. She turns her head. A door opens. Two people who have never spoken. About to. And the whole future of an empire hangs on which of them looks away first. Neither of them does. The alarm cut through the palace like a blade. Before I even understood what was happening, guards in dark violet armor grabbed my arms, pushed me against cold marble, their long fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises that would bloom purple by morning. Someone was shouting, in a language I still barely understood, and the only word I caught clearly was my own name, Corvan Reeve. They were saying it like an accusation, like a curse, like the last word spoken over a grave. I did not come to this planet expecting to die against a marble wall. 3 weeks earlier, I had been nobody. A junior liaison officer on a ship called the Meridian, sent to Elisari because nobody more important wanted the job. And now this, but to understand how I ended up here, pressed against stone, with a princess's fate tangled around my throat like a noose. You have to go back, to the beginning, to the first time I saw her, to Elyndra. The Elisari Dominion is old, older than anything humans have ever built, older than pyramids, older than written language, older than the idea that mothers should love their daughters. Their cities rise in spirals of pale stone, not built, grown, as if the ground itself decided to reach for the sky and never stopped. Our ship arrived on a morning that had no sun, because Elisari has two, and neither of them rises like ours does. They wobble, they dance, they cast shadows in the wrong direction. I remember standing at the viewport, watching the palace grow larger below us, feeling like a man about to walk into a story he was not meant to survive. Delphine Marsh stood beside me, our ambassador, 52 years old, silver at her temples, eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. She said only 3 words to me that morning. "Don't embarrass us." I laughed. She did not. That was the first sign, that this place was going to break something in me I didn't know I could lose. The reception hall was not a room. It was a cathedral. It was a canyon. It was a mouth open wide enough to swallow every human ever born. The ceiling disappeared into shadow above the lights. Nobles in robes the color of deep water and old wine moved through the space like they had been born knowing exactly where to stand. And I did not know where to stand. I did not know how to hold my hands. I did not know how to breathe. Because Elisari nobles do not breathe like we do. They breathe slow. They breathe silent, as if air itself is something they had to earn. I felt like a loud color painted onto a quiet wall. Delphine leaned close, whispered, "Don't stare." "At what?" I said. "At her." And that was when I saw her. She stood at the far end of the hall, alone. Not alone the way I was alone, which was the alone of a stranger in a strange place. She was alone in a different way. She was alone the way a candle is alone in a dark room, the way a wound is alone on a body. Her hair was gold, long, falling to her waist like something spun on a machine that no longer existed. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she had been sculpted from the inside of a seashell. Her eyes, God, her eyes, pale blue, like ice just before it breaks, like the color of a sky that has forgotten how to be warm. She was 24 years old. I would learn that later. And she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and also the loneliest. Nobody spoke to her. They spoke around her, past her, over her, as if she were furniture, or a ghost, or a memory of someone who had died years ago and no one had bothered to tell her yet. I watched a noble reach for a glass on a tray held by a servant. His hand passed inches from her arm. He did not look at her. He did not adjust his path. She had to step back. She stepped back like it was a thing she had learned to do, like a dance she had been rehearsing her whole life. And something in my chest went sideways. "Who is she?" I asked. Delphine did not turn her head. "Princess Elyndra Vaynor, the last heir of the ruling house. Then why is everyone acting like she isn't here?" Delphine finally looked at me. Really looked. The way a mother looks at a child who has asked something they should not ask. Because in this place, she isn't. I did not understand yet. I would. But at that moment, I did the stupidest thing a diplomat has ever done on a first contact mission. I walked across the hall, straight to her. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in ripples. First the nobles nearest her, then the ones near them, then the far corners, until the whole cathedral of a room was holding its breath. I did not notice at first. I was too focused on her face. On the way her chin lifted slightly as I approached. On the way her hand tightened on the small silver cup she was holding. I stopped in front of her. I said, "Hello." That was it. That was the whole crime. Somewhere behind me, Delphine made a small sound, like a woman watching her son walk into traffic. Elyndra looked at me. For a long moment she did not speak, and I thought maybe she did not understand my language, or maybe I had done something so wrong there were no words for it. Then she spoke, in careful, clear English. "Humans," she said, "clearly do not understand court etiquette." Her voice was low, musical, almost amused. I said, "I don't understand much of anything on this planet yet, but I figured a hello never hurt anyone." For a moment, just a moment, something shifted behind her eyes. Not a smile, nothing so warm, but close. She looked at me the way someone looks at a puzzle they were not expecting to find on their doorstep. And then she looked past me, at the frozen room, at all the nobles pretending very hard not to be watching. She said, very quietly, "You should walk away now, before you make it worse." I said, "For you or for me?" She did not answer, but I felt her eyes on my back the whole way across the hall. Delphine did not speak to me until we were back in the embassy wing, in her private office, door closed, windows shuttered. Then she exploded. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" I said hello. "You put a target on her back." She already had a target on her back. Delphine stopped, halfway through pouring herself a drink, looked at me. "How would you know that?" "Because," I said, "I have eyes." She sat down, slowly, rubbed her forehead with 2 fingers, sighed the sigh of a woman who has been sighing since before I was born. "Sit down, Corvan." I sat. She began to tell me things. "The heir succession works only through blood, only through the direct female line, only through the certainty that a daughter can bear a daughter who can bear a daughter. For 1,000 years, the Vaynor house had done exactly that. Until Elyndra, 6 years ago, when she was 18, the royal physicians had declared her barren, not sick, not injured, not treatable, broken. In a society where the throne passes only through blood, a barren heir is not a princess anymore. She is a countdown." Delphine paused, watched me. "The court has spent 6 years, slowly and politely, erasing her from existence. There is a faction, called the Ashen Conquered. They are pushing to remove her from succession entirely, to replace her with a distant cousin, from a house they can control." "And her mother?" I asked. "Doesn't her mother have anything to say about this?" Delphine set her glass down. "Her mother died 18 years ago, when Elyndra was 6. I let that sit for a moment. 6 years old, losing a mother. Something in my chest went very small, because I knew that number. I knew it in my bones. My own mother had died when I was 8, and I still remembered. The way the house smelled different afterwards. The way silence has a weight when there used to be a voice in it." Delphine watched me. "What?" I said. "Nothing. Just, you should know. There is more. More. There has been a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" Delphine picked up her glass again, did not drink from it. "A political marriage, between you and the princess." I laughed. I actually laughed. out loud, because I thought it was a joke. Nobody laughed with me. Delphine watched me until the laugh died in my throat like a candle in a windless room. You cannot be serious, I said. I am extremely serious. Why me? Because you are unmarried. Because you are low-ranking enough that losing you will not damage Earth's standing. And because, according to your service record, you are too stubborn to say no to a direct order from home. She smiled a small, tired smile. I read your file. Corvan, you once refused to leave a burning building until you had recovered 3 research animals. You were reprimanded. But you did it. That is the kind of stubborn we need right now. I stared at her. You want me to marry a princess of an alien empire that I met for 30 seconds? Yes. For political reasons? Yes. To what? Save her. To buy her time. I sat there, feeling something I could not name. Not anger exactly. Not fear. Something older than both. The feeling of being moved. Across a board. By hands that had not asked if I wanted to be moved. I said, does she know? She does. Does she want this? Delphine met my eyes. That is a question you will have to ask her yourself. They gave me 2 days to think about it. I did not sleep for either of them. I walked the palace corridors at night because I could not stand my own room, because the walls were too close, because everything smelled like a plant that did not exist on Earth. The palace was full of long, silent hallways, full of moonlight that came from the wrong direction, full of servants who bowed as I passed and then whispered as soon as I turned the corner. I did not know what they were whispering, but I could guess. Look at the human. Look at the small, loud creature. Look at the one they are giving to the Barren princess. I stopped in front of a window, looked out at the twin moons. One was silver. The other was almost pink. They hung in the sky like 2 eyes watching the same sad play. I thought about my mother. I did not do this often, because thinking about her hurt in a way I had learned to walk around, like a piece of furniture you stop bumping into after enough years. But that night, in that hallway, under 2 moons, I thought about her. I remembered when I was 7. She sat with me on the porch of our small house outside of Denver, and she said, Corvan, someday you are going to meet a person who is being treated like they are nothing, and you are going to have a choice. You can walk past, like everyone else, or you can stop. And whichever one you choose, that is who you will become for the rest of your life. She died the next year, and I never forgot. On the second morning, I told Delphine yes. She did not look surprised. She looked tired. You understand, she said. This is not romance. I understand. You understand. This is a performance. To buy her time. Nothing more. I understand. Corvan. She said my name in a way that made me look up. She may not want this. She may hate you. She may refuse to speak to you. She may treat you like a piece of paper the council signed and shoved under her door. You will need to endure that. I said, Bean, I can endure a lot. She said, I hope so. Then she picked up the folder and handed me the contract and walked out of the room. The wedding contract landed on my desk before I had officially agreed out loud, which told me exactly how much say I actually had. Pages of legal language, translated into English by a machine that clearly did not know what to do with concepts that had no equivalent in human law. One clause described the arrangement as a bonding of houses for the preservation of lineage. Another called me, and I quote, the instrument of continuance. I laughed at that one. The way you laugh at a diagnosis you were not expecting. I signed anyway, because Delphine had reminded me, gently, but firmly, that Earth was still the newest voice at the table, still the smallest child at the family dinner, still the species everyone else called unrefined. If I turned my back now, after the council had gone public with the proposal, it would be read as an insult, not to Elisari, to humanity. I did not want to be the man who broke the first real relationship between our species, so I picked up the pen and I sold my life to a stranger, for her sake, not for mine. The private meeting happened the day before the ceremony. They led me into a small room in the eastern wing, Stone walls, two chairs, a low table, a window overlooking a garden I had not seen yet. Elyndra was already there, sitting, very still, in a robe the color of morning fog. Her hair was pinned up this time, which made her look older, which made her look younger, which made her look like she had been carved out of something that used to be alive. Guards stationed themselves outside. The door closed. We were alone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, without looking at me, "I did not choose this." "I know. Neither did you. I know that too." She turned her head, looked at me for the first time. "Then let us not pretend," I said. "What are we not pretending? That this is anything other than what it is. A political maneuver, a performance for the council, a delay before the inevitable." Her voice did not shake, but something under it did. I sat down across from her. Slowly, I said, "Okay, so we're not pretending, but can I ask you something? Not as your husband, because I'm not that yet, just as a person." She waited. I said, "Do you want to be saved?" She looked at me for a very long time. Then she said, "That is a stupid question." "Maybe, because no one has ever asked me that." "I know. They have asked me what I will do, when I will step aside, whether I will accept my fate with grace, whether I will make things easy for the ones taking my place." Her voice was climbing now, slowly, like water rising in a room where the door will not open. But no one, Corvan Reeve, in 6 years, has asked me what I want, I said. "Then I'm asking." She did not answer for a long time. She looked out the window, at the garden, at the pale flowers with petals like paper. Then she said, very quietly, "I want to know the truth about myself before I die." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She turned back, studied my face, as if she were looking for something, some sign, some proof. She said, "You speak to me like I am a person. You are a person. To you, perhaps. To me, yes." She was silent again. And then, softly, "You should know something before tomorrow." "What?" "I have been preparing for humans for a very long time." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I speak your language because my mother left me the means to learn it. She died when I was 6, but she left instructions, sealed, to be opened when I was 12. On that day, I began. I have studied every day since. That is 12 years now." I felt something cold move through my chest. "Your mother left you instructions?" "Yes." "When you were 12?" "Yes." "Elyndra, humans did not make contact with Alisari until 3 years ago. Your mother has been dead for 18 years. How could she possibly have known?" She looked at me and smiled. For the first time, a small smile, sad and sharp. "I know," she said. "I have thought about that every day for 12 years. I walked back to my quarters that night with my head so full I could not hear my own footsteps. Her mother, dead for 18 years, had known about humans. 15 years before humans arrived. That was not possible. Except a dead woman had left instructions for her daughter to learn our language. Except a princess who had never met a human was already fluent in English. Except somewhere in this palace, there was something old, something buried, something someone had been trying to hide for a very long time. I stopped walking in the middle of the hallway, and I stood there, breathing, trying to arrange my thoughts, because none of them would sit still, because every one of them wanted to run in a different direction, and because underneath all of it, there was a small, stubborn voice that kept saying, "She is telling the truth. She is telling the truth. She is telling the truth." The wedding was small, smaller than I expected. Not the grand hall this time. A private chapel, 10 council members, a priest whose language I did not understand. No music, no flowers, no celebration. Elyndra stood beside me in a robe of pale silver. her hair loose again, falling around her shoulders like something that had been holding its breath for years and finally let go. She did not look at me during the ceremony. She looked forward, at the priest, at nothing, at the wall behind him. Her hand, when it touched mine, was so cold I almost flinched. I did not. I held on. When the priest finished, there was a silence where applause should have been. Nobody clapped. Nobody smiled. A few council members offered the stiffest congratulations I have ever heard, and left, quickly, as if the room might catch fire. Then it was just the two of us, married, in the eyes of an empire, strangers, in every way that mattered. Elyndra turned to me and said, in a voice that could have cut stone, "I hope you did not expect this to mean anything beyond its political purpose." I said, "I did not expect anything at all." Her eyes flicked to mine, sharper, like I had surprised her, which I had, because most men in that moment would have wanted to be told they mattered, would have wanted their new wife to look at them like a possibility. I did not need to matter to her yet. I just needed her to still be here in a year. They led us to the palace wing that would be our home, a long corridor of rooms, separate quarters on each side, a shared sitting area in the middle, a balcony overlooking the eastern gardens. The Elisari. I would learn, do not share bedrooms in political marriages. They share only what the contract requires, which was, in our case, public appearances, formal meals, and a signature at the bottom of a document. Elyndra went to her side of the wing. Without a word, I went to mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark, and I thought about a mother who had been dead for 18 years, who had somehow known about humans. I thought about a diagnosis. 6 years old. That had erased a young woman from her own life. I thought about the way Elyndra had looked at me, when I asked her what she wanted, like nobody had asked her in a very long time. And I made a decision, quietly, in the dark, where no one could see. I decided I was going to find the truth. Not because I loved her. I did not. Not yet. I did not even know her. But because a person had been standing in a room, being erased, for 6 years, and my mother had once told me that when you see someone being treated like nothing, you stop. You stop. The next morning, she came to my door. Just before dawn, I heard the soft knock. I was already awake. I had not slept. I opened the door. She was in a plain gray robe, no jewels, no paint on her face, her hair in a simple braid over one shoulder. She looked 24. She looked 12. She looked 1,000 years old. She said, "I want to show you something." I followed her, not down the corridor, not out into the palace, into her own quarters, which I had never seen. Her rooms were smaller than mine, cleaner, almost bare, as if she had been slowly removing herself from the space for years. But on one wall, there was a bookshelf, and on that bookshelf were books in English, dozens of them, some old, some new, poetry, history, novels, a well-worn atlas, a dictionary with a spine cracked from use. I stared. She said, "Now do you believe me?" I said, "I already believed you." She looked at me, that same look, puzzle, recognition, something warming underneath. Then she crossed the room, knelt beside the bookshelf, pulled out a book that turned out to be not a book at all. A wooden box, carved with vines, about the size of a loaf of bread. She brought it to a small table by the window, set it down carefully, sat. She looked at me and gestured to the chair across from her. I sat. She opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of letters, folded neat, yellowed with age, written on thin paper in a handwriting I could not read but somehow understood was beautiful. She said, "These are from my mother. She wrote them before she died. She left them for me, to open one by one, on specific dates. The first one on my 12th birthday, the last one on my 20th. When did you first read them?" "On the day I turned 12. That was the day I received the first one, and the instructions, and the beginner books, and a small dictionary. She had prepared everything. years in advance. She lifted one letter, carefully, unfolded it. Her hands were shaking slightly. She did not seem to notice. She said, "This one." She wrote it 3 weeks before she died. She held it out to me. I took it, even though I could not read Elisari's script. She had prepared for this. She reached back into the box, pulled out a second piece of paper, in English, in her own handwriting, a translation. She had translated her own mother's letter, for a man she did not yet know would exist. I read it. My hands went cold as I did. The letter said many things, about love, about legacy, about being a mother who was running out of time. But near the end, in one line, it said, "My darling, listen to me now. You are not sick. You are not broken. Do not believe them when they tell you otherwise. Trust the people from the far stars. When they come, they will come." I looked up. Elyndra was watching me, with eyes that were somehow dry and full of tears at the same time. She said, "For 12 years, I have thought this was just the last words of a dying mother, trying to give me hope. She was sick at the end. Her mind, it wandered," I said. "Elyndra?" But then, 6 years ago, they told me I was barren, and I remembered this letter, and I thought, what if she knew? What if she knew somehow? What if... Her voice broke. She stopped. I said very carefully, "What if she knew what..." Elyndra looked at me, and in that moment I saw, not a princess, not an heir, not a political tool, a young woman, 24 years old, who had spent half her life trying not to believe the last thing her dying mother told her, because believing might destroy her, and not believing might destroy her too. She said, "What if they were lying about me?" And she knew, before it happened. I did not answer at first, because I did not know how. Because I was sitting across from a woman who was asking me, in the softest voice I had ever heard, to help her carry a weight that had been crushing her for 6 years. Because outside, somewhere, there was a council, there was a Concord, there were physicians, there were guards, there were people who had built their entire political future on the idea that Elyndra Vaynor was a countdown. And if she was not, if her mother was right, if it had all been a lie, then everything was about to burn. I set the letter down carefully, on the table, between us. I said, "Elyndra." She waited. I said, "If they lied, we are going to find out." She said, "We?" "Yes. You do not owe me this. I know." "Then why?" I thought about my mother on the porch, 2 moons ago, 1,000 years ago, watching me now from wherever she had gone. I said, "Because when someone is being treated like nothing, you stop." That was the only real thing anyone ever taught me. So I am stopping. She looked at me, and for the first time, she reached across the table, and she took my hand. Not for the council, not for the cameras, not for anyone, just because she needed to hold on to something. That was solid. In a room full of things she had been told were true. That might be lies. Her hand was warm this time. Not cold like at the wedding. Warm. I did not go back to my rooms that night. I did not sleep in her rooms either. We did not touch beyond that one held hand. Not yet. Not for a long time. But I sat with her, in her chair by the window, while she read her mother's letters out loud, in English, one after another, slowly, like she was reintroducing me to a woman who had been dead for 18 years. Her mother's name was Sylveth Vaynor. She had been queen for 20 years before she died. She had loved gardening. She had hated formal robes. She had laughed like something startling. She had cried when she was angry. She had known things she should not have known, things she was not supposed to know, things about the future, things about the stars. Elyndra read, and I listened. And somewhere between one letter and the next, the night became morning, the pink moon set, the silver moon set. The suns came up, first one, then the other, 2 rings of light through the paper flowers on the balcony. Elyndra fell asleep in her chair, mid-sentence, the letter drifting from her hand. I caught it before it hit the floor. I looked at her sleeping face, and I thought about how young she looked, how tired. I thought about how she had learned my language for 12 years, waiting, waiting for someone to come, waiting for a mother's promise to become real. And I thought, I did not know if her mother had been right. I did not know if she had been lying about the barrenness. I did not know if she had been dreaming about the stars. I did not know if any of this was going to end anywhere good. But I knew that from this morning on, I was going to find out. I stood up, slowly, so I would not wake her. I folded the letter and set it back in the box. I closed the box. Very quietly, I walked to the door. At the door, I looked back. She was still asleep in the chair, her gold hair coming loose from the braid. One hand curled against her chest, the other hanging at her side. She looked like a child, or an angel, or a woman who had not slept properly in 6 years. I said very softly, to no one, "I'm going to find them," I said. "I'm going to find whoever did this to you." And then I stepped out into the corridor, where the guards were watching, where they'd always been watching, and I felt their eyes follow me, down the hall, around the corner, all the way to my own quarters, where I closed the door, and I sat down at my desk, and I began to make a list of questions, a list of names, a list of every doctor, every physician, every council member, every servant, every whisper I had heard since the day I arrived. Because somewhere, in this palace, was the truth, and I was going to dig it out, with my bare hands if I had to. By nightfall, I had reached one name 3 separate times in 3 separate ways. An old doctor, retired, or nearly, living in a small suite of rooms in the lower physician's wing, 68 years old, once a personal physician to Sylveth Vaynor, then, 6 years ago, quietly, removed from the royal roster, not fired, not disgraced, just moved aside. While a whole new team was appointed, all of them from houses aligned with the Ashen Conquered, the old doctor's name was Thelric Ombron. I underlined it. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I sat back, looked at the name, because something in my gut told me he was the beginning, or he was the ending, or he was both. I did not know how to reach him yet. I did not know if I could trust him. I did not know if approaching him would burn everything down. But he was the door, and I was going to knock on it. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened it, expecting a servant, expecting Delphine, expecting anyone but who I found. A guard, not one of the palace guards, one of the personal guards of the council. He said, in Ayalasari, which I was still learning but understood well enough, "You are summoned." By whom? By the Ashen Conquered. I felt my stomach drop out of my body. He said, "One of them wishes to meet you, privately, today, in 1 hour." I said, "Which one?" He looked at me, steady, cold. "Lord Caevros Thal." The name landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. I had heard whispers about Caevros. In 3 weeks, I had heard whispers about no one else so often. He was the head of the Conquered. He was the man building the case against Elyndra. He was the wall her future was going to crash against. And he wanted to meet me, alone. The day after my wedding, the day I had started to make my list of names, the day I had underlined Thelric Ombron 3 times, I looked at the guard, and I made my face very still. I said, "Tell him I will be there." The guard bowed, left. I closed the door. I leaned against it. I breathed, because I had a feeling, a very specific feeling, deep in the pit of my stomach, that whatever Caevros Thal wanted from me, it was not friendship. It was a warning, or a threat, or a test. And whatever it was starting, right now, the thing I had promised her, the thing I had promised my mother's memory, the thing I had promised myself, was starting, and I was not ready, but I was going anyway. I dressed carefully, formal robes, small silver pin from the embassy. I combed my hair. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment, The man looking back at me was not the same man who had stepped off the ship 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I had been a junior liaison officer, sent because no one important wanted the job. Small, loud, unrefined. Now I was a husband, a conspirator, a man with a list of names hidden in a drawer. I did not know if the change was an improvement, but I knew there was no going back. I looked at the pink stone rising outside the window, the two suns hanging in a strange sky. I whispered, to no one, to my mother, to myself. Here we go. And I opened the door. And I stepped into the corridor, and I walked toward Kyaevros Thal, and behind me, in another wing, in a room I had left just hours before, a young woman with gold hair, who had waited 12 years for a man from the far stars, was still sleeping in a chair, with her mother's letters in a wooden box on the table beside her. She did not know yet that the war for her life had just begun, but it had. And I, Corvan Reeve, a 28-year-old junior liaison officer from Denver, was going to fight it. For her mother, for every young woman who had ever been called broken, by men who benefited from the breaking. I did not know if I would survive it, but I was going to try. I turned the corner. Kyaevros Thal's guards were waiting. They opened a heavy door. I walked in, and the door closed behind me. The room was cold. Not chilly, not drafty. Cold in the way a knife is cold. Cold in the way a body is cold. Cold on purpose. Kyaevros Thal was already seated when I entered. He did not stand. He did not gesture for me to sit. He simply watched me, the way a man watches a bird land inside his house, calculating whether it was worth catching, or crushing, or letting fly out again. I was 55 years old, silver hair pulled back into a long braid, his face carved from something harder than skin, his eyes the color of old iron. He wore no jewels, no robes of state, just plain gray, which was somehow worse, because a man who does not need to dress like power is a man who already has it. He said, "Sit down, Mr. Reeve." I sat. He said, "You do not belong here." I said, "I know." He blinked. Once, that was not the answer he expected. He said, "Then why did you sign the contract?" "Because I was told to." "By whom?" "By my superiors." "You could have refused." "I could have." "Yes, but you did not." "No." He tilted his head, studying me. Like an insect he was deciding whether to name. He said, "Do you understand what you have married into?" "I am beginning to." "No." He said, "You are not." There was a long silence. I did not fill it, because I knew that trick. It is one of the first things they teach you at diplomat school. When someone stops talking, do not rush to speak. The silence is a trap. The silence is a test. Whoever fills it first loses. Kyaevros almost smiled. Almost. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. He appreciated that I knew the game. Finally, he said, "Let me be clear, Mr. Reeve, because I do not have patience for the games your people usually play." "All right." "The princess is finished. She has been finished for 6 years. The physicians confirmed it. The council accepted it. The bloodline of Vaynor ends with her. This is not a tragedy. This is a fact." I said nothing. "Your marriage," he continued, "is a delay, nothing more, a gesture from a house that cannot accept its own ending. And your government, which apparently believes it can insert itself into an empire whose foundations were laid before your species learned to farm." I said, "I did not come here to argue." "No, you came here to listen." "All right." He leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. He said, "The delay is over. Mr. Reeve, the council will move within 3 months to formalize the succession transfer to a cousin from a house we can trust. Your marriage will end quietly. You will return to Earth, alive, if you cooperate." I said, "And if I do not?" He smiled then. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had made this speech before, to people who had not survived it. He said, "Then you will still return to Earth, just not alive." I did not move. I did not blink. I did not breathe, because he had just told me, in the plainest language possible, that if I did not do what he wanted, he would have me killed, and no one in this palace would ask why. I said very carefully, "What exactly do you want me to do?" He said, "Nothing. Nothing. Yes, nothing. Do not ask questions. Do not seek information. Do not visit archives. Do not speak to physicians. Do not encourage the princess to do the same. Attend the required public events. Smile, and in 3 months, you will go home," I said. "And if I do this, she goes quietly," he said. "She goes quietly, yes, to a private estate where she will live out her life, comfortably, away from politics. She will not be harmed." I said, "Do you swear that—" I looked at me, long and slow. He said, "I do not swear things to humans." I walked out of that room. I do not remember opening the door. I do not remember the guards. I do not remember the corridor. I remember only the ringing in my ears, like a bell that had been struck inside my skull, and the taste in my mouth, which was iron, which was fear, which was rage, because he had known. Kaevros had known about my list, my questions, my underlining of Thelric Ombron's name 3 times in the dark. He could not have known specifics. Not yet, but he had sensed it, or someone had told him something, or he was simply the kind of man who could smell defiance the way a wolf smells blood. He had summoned me, to warn me off, before I had even taken the first step, which meant I was already close to something, which meant I was right. I did not tell Elyndra about the meeting that day. I could not, because I did not trust the walls, because I did not trust the servants, because I did not trust my own voice yet to say the words without shaking. Instead, I went about the day like a man made of glass, attended a lunch, smiled at nobles who did not smile back, signed 3 documents I did not read, nodded at Delphine when I passed her in the hall. She caught my sleeve. "Just for a second," she said. "You look pale." I said, "I feel pale." She said, "Corvan." I said, "Later, please." She let me go. That night, when the palace was quiet, I went to Elyndra's rooms. I did not knock. I opened the door softly, slipped inside. She was awake, sitting by the window, reading. She looked up, saw my face, set the book down. Immediately, she said, "What happened?" I said, "Not here." She stood, understood at once. She was quicker than me, always. That was something I would learn about her over the coming months. She could read a room before I finished walking into it. She led me out onto the balcony, where the wind was up, where the paper flowers were rustling, where no ear could easily catch a whisper. She said again, "What happened?" I told her, every word. Kaevros, the room, the threat, the 3 months. Her face did not change, not visibly, not to anyone watching, but I could see it, in her eyes, something small and old and tired, coming to the surface, recognizing itself. She said, "He told you what he told my mother." I said, "What?" She said, "That is what he said to my mother, before she died. I heard it. I was 6 years old. I was hiding under a table in her sitting room. He came in. He said to her, something like, 'Sylveth, the delay is over. She goes quietly, or she does not go at all.'" I stared at her. She said, "I have not remembered that in 18 years. I said, "Elyndra," she said, "Corvan, I do not think my mother died of a fever." We stood there, on the balcony, for a long time. The wind pulled at her hair, loose gold strands moving across her face. She did not brush them back. Finally, I said, "We have to be careful." She said, "Yes. We have to move slowly." "Yes. But we have to move." "Yes." She turned to me, and in the moonlight she looked younger than her 24 years, and older than her 24 years, and more determined than I had ever seen a person look. She said, "Corvan, if they killed my mother, if they made me into this, if they took away my whole life and made me believe I was broken, When I was not. She stopped, steadied her voice, kept going. Then I want them to answer for it. All of them. And I do not care what it costs me. I said, it might cost you your life. She said, they took my life 6 years ago. They just did not tell me. The next weeks were slow. They had to be slow because everything was watched now. The guards outside our door, the servants delivering our meals, the nobles who suddenly began speaking to me at official functions, trying to smile, trying to fish. We adapted. We spoke of nothing important indoors. We took long walks in the gardens, where the wind covered our voices. We wrote notes to each other on scraps of paper, read them, burn them in the fireplace. We ate meals together, in public, in the state dining hall, where the whole court could watch us, being polite, being distant, being exactly what everyone expected of a political marriage. But in private, in the small corners the palace could not reach. Something else was growing. It began with small things, sharing tea in the afternoons, because the schedule demanded it, except we started staying past when the schedule ended. She asked me about Earth, not out of politeness, out of hunger. I told her about oceans, about storms, about the smell of pine trees, about the way my grandfather used to sit on his porch and whistle to birds until they whistled back, about my mother's laugh, about the year I broke my arm falling out of a tree trying to see the Milky Way better. She listened all the way through. She never once looked away. She told me about Aelisari, about the twin moons, about the way children were taught to name the stars, about her father, who had died when she was 15, of grief, 9 years after her mother. She told me about the winter the palace flooded when she was 11, about the servant who taught her to braid her hair, about the way her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. She sang a few notes of the song, softly. It broke me a little to hear her voice like that, human, unguarded. One evening she asked me, "Do you miss your mother?" I said, "Every day, even now, especially now." "Why especially?" I thought about it, turned the teacup in my hands. I said, "Because she would have known what to do. She was better at this than me. All of this, being brave, making decisions. She had a way of looking at hard things without flinching." Elyndra was quiet. Then she said, "I think you flinch less than you believe." I looked up. She said, "Corvan, my mother would have liked you." That knocked the breath out of me, because I did not know I had been waiting to be told that by anyone, about my own mother, about her mother, about any mother. I said, thank you." She said, "Ish, do not thank me. It is a fact, not a gift," which was a very Elyndra thing to say. And she smiled, and I smiled. And for a moment, just a moment, there was no palace, no council, no Kaevros, no threat, just two people, drinking tea, missing their mothers. The night everything shifted was a storm night. The wind came up from the east, off the mountains. It rattled the palace windows in a way I had never heard. Sharp cracks of thunder, not like earth thunder, higher, sharper, almost musical. I was in my quarters, reading, trying to sleep, failing. I heard the soft knock. I opened the door. She was in her nightgown, bare feet, her hair loose, her eyes wide in the way of someone who had been trying not to cry. She said, "I am sorry," I said. "For what?" She said, "For coming here. I know we said we were not going to. I know this is not part of the arrangement." I said, "Elyndra?" She said, "The storm. When I was small, there was a storm the night my mother died. It sounded like this. And I cannot be alone tonight. I am sorry. I know it is stupid. I am 24 years old and I am acting like a child." I said, "You are not acting like a child." She said, "I can go." I said, "Please stay." I let her in. I closed the door. I did not touch her. She did not touch me. I gestured to the sitting room. She curled up in the chair by the window, pulled a blanket over her knees, watched the sky flash white. I sat across from her. We did not talk. For hours, we did not talk. We just sat, in the low light, listening to the storm. Two people who had lost their mothers. Two people who had learned, very early, that being alone in a storm is a specific kind of pain that never goes away. At some point, she fell asleep, curled in the chair, one hand tucked under her cheek. I got up, slowly, draped another blanket over her, sat back down, did not sleep, watched her breathe, watched the storm move away, watched dawn come up, pale and pink and gold. She woke just as the second sun was rising. She looked at me. She did not look embarrassed. She looked like she had slept for the first time in a long time. She said, "Thank you," I said. "Anytime." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I mean that, Corvan, anytime." And she stood, and she went back to her side of the wing. And after that, nothing was the same. We started planning. We were careful, painfully careful. We chose our first ally, Isara Vosk. She was 30 years old, small, quiet. She worked in the palace archives. She had once served briefly as a junior secretary in the household of Elyndra's mother. Elyndra had noticed, over the years, that Isara was one of the very few servants who still looked at her directly, who still spoke to her without shrinking. We invited her to a small tea, ostensibly to help catalog some of Elyndra's mother's old books. A boring administrative task, a cover. She came. She sat with us for over an hour. We spoke of nothing. We watched her. She watched us. Finally, Elyndra said, very quietly, "Isara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that if you say no, nothing changes. You walk out of here, and I never mention it again. But if you say yes, your life becomes very, very dangerous." Isara looked at her for a long moment, and then she said the thing that broke something open inside me. She said, "Princess, I have been waiting to be asked." Isara was a gift. She had access. She knew the archives. She knew which vaults were watched and which were not. She knew which physicians had been reassigned, when, where they had gone, who had replaced them. Over the next 2 weeks, she fed us information, in small pieces, slipped inside books, whispered in the garden, written in code on the back of laundry receipts. The pattern that emerged was chilling. 6 years ago, within an 11-month period, 9 senior physicians had been reassigned, all of them, every single one, away from the royal family. Some to distant outposts, some to research stations. 2 of them had died en route, both accidents, both unexplained. Their replacements had all come from 3 noble houses, all of them loyal to the Ashen Conquered. One of the reassigned physicians, one of the very few still alive and still on Elisari, was Thelric Ombron. I had underlined his name 3 times, weeks ago. Now Isara was underlining it again, in front of me, whispered in the garden, under the paper flowers. She said, "He is your first door." He knew her mother. I approached him carefully. He lived in a small suite of rooms in the lower physician's wing, a place the important doctors never went anymore. It smelled of old herbs, old paper, old regret. I made an appointment, under the pretense of a mild human ailment, a stomach thing. I claimed the palace food did not always sit well with me, which was true, which made it a good lie. He examined me with quiet efficiency, barely spoke. His hands were steady. His eyes did not meet mine. At the end of the appointment, he handed me a small pouch of dried herbs, instructions written on the outside. "Boil this. Drink twice a day." I took it. I said, "Dr. Ombron." He glanced up. I said, "You served the Queen, Sylvith Vaynor. Did you not?" His face did not change, but his hands, they went very still. He said, "I did." I said, "I would like to ask you about her, someday, when it is safe." I was quiet for a long time. Then he said, very softly. It is never safe, Mr. Reeve, but I have been waiting 6 years for someone to ask. He came to us 3 nights later. Not to the palace, not to our wing. That would have been noticed. Isara arranged it, a small private greenhouse, on the far edge of the gardens, kept for the cultivation of medicinal plants, warm, green, loud with the humming of insects that lived nowhere else on the planet. He was already there when we arrived, sitting on a stone bench between two enormous ferns. He stood when Elyndra entered. He bowed, very low, very slow. He said, "Princess." She said, "Doctor." He said, "I have not been able to look at you in 6 years without wanting to be sick." She stopped. He said, you look so much like her. It hurts to be near you." Elyndra sat very slowly on the bench across from him. She said, "Then tell me, why?" He closed his eyes. He said, "Because I signed the paper that called you Barren 6 years ago, and I have wanted to die every day since." The greenhouse was very quiet. The insects were still humming, somewhere, but I could not hear them anymore. All I could hear was my own heart, and Elyndra's breathing, which had gone shallow. Thelric spoke, softly, as if the words hurt his throat. He said, 6 years ago, I was called into a meeting, just me, alone, 2 members of the Ashen Concord, and a physician I had never seen before. Newly appointed, they had a document, already prepared, already stamped, requiring my signature, as one of the senior royal physicians. "What did it say, I asked. He said, it said that the Princess Elyndra Vaynor had been examined, extensively, and determined to be permanently incapable of conception, due to a congenital defect, detectable in early adolescence but only recently confirmed, barren, beyond all treatment." Elyndra sat very still. He said, "I refused. At first, I said I would not sign what I had not verified. They said, in that case, my daughter's placement at the university would be reconsidered. My wife's position at the Botanical Archives would be reconsidered. My son's residency in the Eastern Outpost would be reconsidered." He looked up. He said, "I have 3 children. Princess, I am so sorry." There was silence again. Not the silence of a room without sound. The silence of a room where something enormous is happening, that no one has the words for. Elyndra did not speak. I did not speak. Thelric said, "I signed, and I have carried it, every day, for 6 years, and I have never, in all my life, regretted anything as much." I said, "Doctor." He looked at me. I said, "Was there ever any evidence?" "That she was barren," he said. "No," I said, "none at all." I said, "None. Her original examinations, the ones from before, showed nothing, nothing at all, perfectly healthy, perfectly ordinary." I said, "And you would testify to that?" He looked at me, really looked, and I saw, in his eyes, that he was calculating something. His children, his wife, his own life, weighed against the 6 years of silence that had been eating him alive. He said, "Yes, I would." Elyndra spoke for the first time. Her voice was so soft I almost missed it. She said, "Dr. Ombron." He looked at her. She said, "Come here." He stood, slow, uncertain. He crossed to where she sat. He knelt in front of her, because he did not know what else to do. Because a man who has spent 6 years believing he has destroyed a young woman's life cannot stand in front of her. She reached out. She took his hand. She said, "You were used, like I was used. We were both used by the same people." He began to cry. Not loud, not messy, just slow tears down a face that had forgotten how to cry. She said, "I forgive you." He said, "Princess, you cannot." She said, "I can, and I do." There is a certain kind of moment that happens sometimes, in life, where you understand, in your bones, that you are watching something holy. I had never had one before. I have not had one since, but I had one that night, in that greenhouse, between the ferns. I watched a young woman, 24 years old, take the hand of a man who had once helped destroy her, and forgive him. Not because he deserved it, but because she deserved to walk out of that room lighter than she walked in. I thought about my mother. She had told me, sometimes the person doing the harm is also being harmed, somewhere, by someone else, and the whole chain will keep going, forever, unless someone, somewhere, chooses to break it. Elyndra broke it that night. Just by choosing to, Thelric brought us documents. Not that night. He was too shaken. But the next week, and the week after that, he brought Elyndra's original examination records, from before the diagnosis. He brought his own private notes, from a conversation with a colleague, 6 years ago, who had raised the same concerns Thelric had, and who had been reassigned to a research outpost, where she had died within a year, in an accident. He brought something else, something he had not intended to bring, that he found only because he was looking now. In every corner of his old files, a note, in Sylveth's handwriting, from 18 years ago, 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks before her death. It was addressed to him. Thelric, old friend, something is wrong with me. It comes and goes. It burns and then rests. The palace physicians say it is nothing, but I know my own body. I have carried a child. I have healed from injuries. I have known what wellness feels like. This is not that. Please, when you can, test the tea I have wrapped inside this letter. Thelric had received the letter 18 years ago. He had opened it, read it, been called away by an emergency in a lower ward. By the time he came back, Sylveth was dead. The tea was still wrapped inside. He had, in his shock and grief, never tested it. He had put the letter away, in a drawer, meaning to, someday, and someday had never come. Until now, he tested it in the greenhouse, away from any official laboratory. With small equipment he had smuggled out over weeks. The tea was laced with a slow-acting Alisari toxin, undetectable at the time of death, extracted from a rare mountain plant, traceable, if you knew what to look for, to one supplier, in a single region, under the influence of one house, the Thal house, Kyevros Thal's house, and there was more. Because now that Thelric was looking, he was looking at everything, in every drawer, in every file, in every corner of a life he had spent decades filling with paper. He found another letter, from Sylveth, from 19 years ago, 1 year before her death. Elyndra read it aloud in the greenhouse, her voice thin as a thread pulled tight. The letter said, Thelric, I have found something in the deep archives, a record of an old visitor, a traveler from beyond the stars, not from our sky, not from anywhere our books have named before. He came in a small metal vessel. He crashed in the far northern range, 15 years before this letter, long before I was queen. My mother knew of him. She kept him hidden. He lived among us for 4 years. He died of a wound that our medicine did not understand. He left behind books, instruments, a language. He told my mother his people would come one day. Not soon, but someday. He asked her to prepare her line, so that when they came, we would not receive them as enemies. She kept the archive secret. She told only me. She told me because she was dying, and because I was her only child. Now I am telling you, because I am dying too, and because the ones who are killing me also want the archive. They want the knowledge for themselves, to control what happens when the visitors return. If I do not survive, please guard my daughter. Teach her. Tell her that she is not alone, that the far stars are real, and that one of them will come for her. Elyndra put the letter down. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were not wet. She said, so my mother knew, because her mother knew, because a man crashed on this planet, long before anyone knew we were not alone. Thelric said, Princess, I did not know any of this. She never told me. She was trying to protect me. Perhaps. I said, the archive. Where is it? Elyndra looked at me. She said, Corvan, if it existed, it has been hidden for over 30 years. If the conquered has been searching for it and has not found it, then my grandmother hid it well. I said, your grandmother? She said, yes. I said, Elyndra, your grandmother is dead. She died when you were 2. She looked at Thelric. Thelric looked at her. He said, very quietly, Princess, I have never actually seen her body. The greenhouse went silent. Elyndra sat on the greenhouse bench that night. When Thelric told her, she did not cry. She had cried already, weeks ago, when she first understood her mother had been murdered. Now she just sat, very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gold hair catching the light of the humming lamps. She said, so he killed her, because she was going to find out what he was planning to do to me later. And because she had the archive, Thelric said. Yes, she said. And then he waited 12 years and did it anyway. Thelric said, yes. She was silent. Then she said, very quietly, almost to herself, he is going to answer for all of it, every year of it, every letter she never got to read, every birthday I did not have her at, every night I sat under 2 moons trying to understand why I was less than everyone else. He is going to answer for it. I said, he will. She looked at me. She said, Corvan, promise me. I said, I promise. Sarah found the letter 3 nights later. She had been slipping into the deep archives, in the old Physicians Guild, the way we had asked her to, looking for anything, any correspondence, any note, any name. She came to us just after midnight, pale, shaking, a folded parchment in her hand. She said, Princess, I found something. I do not know what to do with it. She held it out. Elyndra took it, unfolded it, read it. I watched her face, and I watched her face change, slowly, slowly, from focus to disbelief, to a stillness so deep I thought for a moment she had stopped breathing. She said, Corvan, I said. What? She said, read this. I took it. The letter was dated 22 years ago, signed by a court official whose name meant nothing to me. It was addressed to the abbess of a remote convent in the northern mountains. It concerned, and I quote, the placement of one high-ranking woman for her own protection under permanent seclusion, effective immediately. The woman's name was there, in careful, precise handwriting, Ithara Vaynor. I looked up. I said, Elyndra, who is Ithara Vaynor? She was staring at the wall. She said, very softly, my grandmother. Her eyes came back to mine. She said, Corvan, if this is real. She could not finish the sentence. Isara said, Princess, it is real. The seal is genuine. I compared it. I checked. It is real. Elyndra sat down, very slowly. On the edge of the bench, she said, my grandmother is alive. She said it like a prayer. She said it like a wound. She said it like a woman who had just been handed a piece of a life she thought had been buried. We could not move immediately. We had to plan. We had to prepare. We had to be sure. Because if we were wrong, or if we were seen, everything ended. We spent 2 weeks arranging it. 2 weeks of careful lies. 2 weeks of Delphine looking at me with worried eyes and not asking questions. 2 weeks of pretending to smile at council functions. 2 weeks of Isra whispering in the garden. Thelric passing small parcels wrapped in linen. Guards watching. Nobles watching. Everyone watching. Then, one morning, before dawn, under the excuse of a personal pilgrimage to a mountain shrine, sanctioned by the council, encouraged even, because they thought it was Elyndra retreating, preparing to accept her fate, we left, just the 2 of us, and one very quiet driver Ysara had vouched for. in a plain-covered carriage, up a road that wound and wound and wound into the northern mountains. For 2 days we traveled. Elyndra did not speak much. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were on the passing pines, which were not pines exactly, silver blue trees with soft feathery needles. At one point, on the second afternoon, she said, "Whoosh. What if she does not remember me?" I said, she will. She said, "What if she is not the same?" I said, "She will be someone, even if she is not the person you remember." She said, "Corvan." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am scared." I reached across the seat. I took her hand. I said, I know, and I said, "So am I." I said, "Let's be scared together." She held on. The convent was smaller than I expected. Not a cathedral, not a fortress, a cluster of stone buildings tucked into a fold of the mountain, terraced gardens climbing the slope, a quiet bell ringing somewhere, wood smoke rising from 3 chimneys. We arrived just before sunset, both suns hanging low, painting everything gold and pink. The abbess met us at the gate, a small woman, dressed simply. She looked at Elyndra for a long moment before she spoke. She said, "You are Sylveth's daughter." Elyndra said, "Yes." The abbess said, "I have been expecting someone for 22 years." She led us up a winding stone path, through a garden of low silver plants, past cells of quiet women bent over their work, to a small terrace overlooking the valley. There was a woman there, 72 years old, white hair pulled back, simple linen robe, a wooden trowel in one hand, a small basket of dark red berries at her feet. She was tending a rose bush. She did not look up as we approached. She was concentrating on a particular thorn, removing it carefully, whispering something to the plant. The abbess said, "Ithara, there is someone here to see you." The old woman looked up. She saw Elyndra, and she dropped the trowel. She stood, slowly. Every year of the 22 she had spent on this mountain visible in the way her knees straightened. She whispered, "Sylveth," Elyndra said. "No, grandmother, it is me, Elyndra, Sylveth's daughter." The old woman brought both hands to her mouth. She said, "Elyndra, little bird." Elyndra took one step, and then another, and then she was running, and then she was in her grandmother's arms, sobbing, in a way I had never heard her cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of a princess, the great heaving sobs of a child, who had believed, for 22 years, that there was no one left. Ithara held her, small and thin and steady as a rock in a river. She whispered, "You came, you came. Oh, little bird, I knew you would come. I knew you would come. I told them one day you would come." I stood back, away, because this was not my moment. The 2 suns were setting. The whole valley below us was on fire with gold. And here, on a stone terrace, in front of a rose bush, a grandmother and a granddaughter were finding each other again. After 22 years of lies, I stood back and I let them have it. And I thought about my mother, because I could not think about her, because the whole world had come around to the truth, that my mother had been right when she told me, as a boy of 7, that when you see someone being treated like nothing, you stop. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, what you stop is not just a small unkindness. Sometimes it is a whole invisible wall that has been standing for decades, between a granddaughter and a grandmother and a truth and a future. We spent that night at the convent. Ithara made us tea from herbs she had grown herself. She sat with Elyndra by the fire until dawn, telling her stories, about her mother, about her father, about her own life, about the 22 years in this quiet stone place. She told us, simply, what had happened. 22 years ago, she had begun to suspect that something was wrong within the Ashen Concord, that they were planning something against her daughter Sylveth, that they were also searching for something older. An archive from the far northern range, that she and her mother before her had protected for 2 generations. She had gathered evidence, carefully, slowly, not enough, not fast enough. They had come for her in the night, not to kill her. That would have been suspicious. Instead, they had told her they would kill Sylveth, immediately, publicly, if she did not go quietly, into permanent seclusion, in this convent, never to leave, never to write, never to be spoken of again. She had gone to protect her daughter, and her daughter had died anyway. 4 years later, she had known, in her bones, that Sylveth had been murdered, but by then, it was too late. She said, "I have lived in this stone place for 22 years, tending roses, waiting, because I knew, if there was any justice left in the universe, someday, my granddaughter would come." Elyndra said. "Grandmother, will you come home with us?" Ethara said. "Little bird, if you take me down that mountain, they will try to kill me." Elyndra said. "Yes," Ethara said, "and I will not be a comfortable guest. I will be a witness. I will testify, in front of every noble house, every council member, every physician, every last one of them, and they will fear me." She looked at Elyndra. She said, "You will not be safe, because of me." Elyndra said, "I have not been safe, for a very long time, grandmother." Ethara looked at me then. She said, "And you, small loud creature from the far stars?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Will you protect my granddaughter?" I said, Ma'am, until my last breath." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could feel her seeing me, all the way through, the way old women can. She said, "Yes, I believe you will." She stood up, straightened her back, which had been stooped an hour before. She said, "Then let us go down this mountain and burn the truth in front of them until it consumes them all." We left the convent at first light. We did not go back the way we had come, because Caevros Thal was going to know, very soon, that his most inconvenient prisoner had walked out of a stone building she had not left in 22 years. And when he knew, he was going to move. Fast and viciously. We took an alternate road, longer, rougher, through a mountain pass. Ysera had arranged a second driver, a woman she trusted with her life. We rode in near silence for the first day. At sunset, Ethara sat looking out the window, watching a land she had not seen in more than 2 decades. She said softly, "It is smaller than I remembered," Elyndra said. "Grandmother," Ethara said, "everything is small. When you have been away too long." She turned, and she looked at Elyndra. She said, "Little bird, whatever happens next, you must promise me one thing." Elyndra said, "Anything." Ethara said, "When we walk into that hall, in front of that council, you must not shake. You must not lower your eyes. You must not apologize for existing." She reached out, touched Elyndra's face. She said, "You are the last of us, but you are also the first of what comes next, and what comes next belongs to you, not to them." Elyndra closed her eyes. She said, "Yes, grandmother." Ethara said, "Good. Now sleep. Tomorrow, we change the world." The last night before we reached the palace, we stopped at a small inn on the edge of a river. Ethara went to bed early. The old make an art of resting when they can. Elyndra and I sat on a low wooden porch, watching the river run, watching the moons rise. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then she said, "Corvan." I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever happens tomorrow." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to know." She stopped. I waited. She said, "I love you." I turned to look at her. She was watching the river, not me. Her profile was pale and steady in the moonlight. She said, "I did not plan to. I did not want to. It was not part of the arrangement." She turned then, looked at me. She said, "But I love you, and I do not want to walk into that hall tomorrow." Without saying it, Once, just once, in case. I did not let her finish. I reached out, I took her face in both my hands, and I said, Elyndra Vaynor, listen to me. I love you. Not because of a contract, not because of a council, not because of a mother who is gone. I love you because you are the bravest person I have ever met in my entire small human life, and you deserve every good thing this universe has to offer. She began to cry. She said, Corvan. I said, and tomorrow we are going to walk into that hall, and your grandmother, and your doctor, and your ambassador, and Ysara, and I are going to stand behind you, and we are going to end this. For your mother, for you, for every child of every generation who will not have to grow up under a lie. She said, yes. I said, yes. She said, yes. And we sat there, on that wooden porch, under a rising moon. Two people who had married as strangers, who had begun as pieces on a board, who had become, somewhere along the way, something no council could have designed if it tried. Two people who loved each other and who were about to walk into a room full of monsters. Together. We reached the outskirts of the capital just after dawn. Ysara was waiting. Delphine was waiting. Thelric was waiting. In a small safe house Ysara had arranged, just outside the city. They stared at Ethara, all three of them, like they were looking at a woman who had walked out of a tomb. Ethara nodded at each of them, as if she had known them her whole life. Perhaps in some way she had. Delphine said, Corvan, the council session is in 6 hours. The ceremony will proceed. As planned, Kaiavros knows nothing. Yet, I said, then we move fast. Ethara said, then we move together. Elyndra said, simply, steadily, in a voice that made every person in the room turn to her. She said, then we go home. The morning of the ceremony, I woke before either sun. Elyndra was already awake, sitting by the window, watching the sky. She was dressed, formal robes, deep blue, the color of Elisari's state. Her hair was down, loose, gold falling across her shoulders like something spun by a slower kind of god. She did not turn when I entered the room. She said, I did not sleep. I said, I know. She said, I did not sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I said, your mother's? She said, yes. I sat down on the edge of the chair beside her. I did not touch her yet, because sometimes touch is louder than words, and sometimes silence is louder than both. She said, very softly, what if I am not brave enough? I said, Elyndra. She said, what if I stand up in that hall and I open my mouth and nothing comes out? I said, then I will speak for you until you can. She turned, finally, looked at me. She said, you would? I said, I would. She said, Corvan. I said, yes. She said, I am glad that out of every human in the far stars, it was you they sent. I said nothing, because if I had spoken, I would have cried. And she did not need my tears that morning. She needed my steadiness. There is a garden on the eastern edge of the palace. Small, quiet, enclosed. Not the ceremonial gardens where the court walks. A private one, belonging to the royal wing, full of low silver plants and paper flowers and one old bench. I found Elyndra there, an hour before the ceremony, standing very still, not praying. Elisari does not pray, not the way we do, but something like it. Standing very still, in the presence of things larger than herself. I did not interrupt. I waited. After a long moment, she turned, and she saw me. She said, come here. I went to her. She reached up, took my face in both her hands, which was a thing she had done exactly once. On the porch by the river, when she told me she loved me, she said, Corvan Reeve, listen to me now. I said, I am listening. She said, whatever happens in that hall, if it goes well, If it goes badly, if we win, if we lose, if we walk out together, if we do not, I said, Elyndra. She said, you gave me back my life. In the 6 months since you arrived, you gave me back my life. And I want you to know, before we go in there, that whatever the universe does to us next, you already gave me the only thing I ever wanted. I said, which was, she said, someone who looked at me like I was real. I could not answer. I only held her, and she held me, and we stood there, small in the garden, under 2 suns, just before the world changed forever. The grand hall was full. Nobles from every province, council members in their tiered rows, physicians standing along the walls, guards at every entrance, servants pressed into the back corners, trying to see the whole of Elisari politics, packed into a single stone cathedral, under a ceiling that vanished into shadow. I stood beside Elyndra at the center of the floor, in the appointed place, in the appointed robes. Delphine stood 2 paces behind us, Ysara 6 paces behind her, Thelric among the physicians, blending in, waiting. And Ithara was not in the hall yet. She was in a small side room, waiting for her cue, because a woman thought dead for 22 years should not walk in during the pleasantries. She should walk in when the world was already listening. The ceremony began. A senior council member, old, robed in white, rose and recited the traditional opening about bloodline, about continuity, about the eternal Vaynor line and its coming transition. The word transition landed like a stone, because everyone in the hall knew what that word meant. It meant the removal of Elyndra, politely, traditionally, in front of everyone. I could feel her breathing beside me, steady, slow, trained. She had spent 6 years learning to breathe through public erasure. She was breathing through it now. I could not do the same. I could feel my own heart hammering, because I knew what was coming. I knew what we were about to break. Kyaivros Thal was seated, in the front row, directly across from us. He was watching me, his iron eyes. Not on Elyndra, on me. Me. I was smiling, and the barest possible smile. I thought he had won. He thought I had followed his instructions. He thought this was the morning he had waited for since he had murdered a queen 18 years ago. He was about to learn. He was about to learn. Delphine stepped forward. She raised one hand. She said, in perfect Elisari, which I had never known she could speak so well. Honored Council, before the transition proceeds, the Earth Embassy requests the floor. The hall stirred. Murmurs. The old white-robed counselor blinked, turned, looked at his colleagues, consulted, reluctantly, nodded. He said, Ambassador Marsh, you have the floor. Briefly, Delphine said. I will need more than briefly. She turned to face the whole hall. She said, 6 years ago, Princess Elyndra Vaynor was declared Barren by royal physicians. That declaration has shaped every political decision in this hall for 6 years. That declaration is the foundation of everything that is about to happen here today. She paused. She said, that declaration was a lie. The hall exploded. Not with sound at first, with silence. The particular silence of a room where 300 people have simultaneously realized that the ground beneath them is moving. Then, all at once, the shouting began. Council members rose from their seats, some in outrage, some in confusion, some already reaching for their advisors, whispering. Kyaivros Thal did not rise. He watched. He watched Delphine with the steady coldness of a man deciding how much of a fire this was and how quickly it needed to be put out. Delphine did not flinch. She said, louder, I have documentation from the original royal physicians, predating the diagnosis, showing that no medical basis for the declaration ever existed. She said, I have testimony from one of the physicians who signed the diagnosis, confirming that he was coerced, that the evidence was falsified, and that this coercion was directed by members of the Ashen Conquered. She paused, and she said, softly, but it carried like a blade, And I have evidence that the mother of Princess Elyndra Vaynor, Queen Sylveth, did not die of a fever 18 years ago. She was poisoned, slowly, by a substance traceable to the House of Thal. Kyaevros Thal stood up, slowly. He did not shout. He did not gesture. He simply stood, and the whole hall turned to look at him. He said calmly, "Ambassador Marsh, you are a guest in this empire, and you are speaking accusations. Without proof," Delphine said. "Am I?" I said, "You are. Anything you claim to have was fabricated by a princess who is desperate, by a foreign embassy that wishes to leverage her position for its own influence in this empire. It is a crude maneuver, and it will fail." He turned to the council. He said, "Honored members, this is exactly what I have warned you about. For 6 years, this is what happens when we allow outsiders into our politics. They insert themselves. They fabricate crises. They attempt to reshape our succession to their own advantage." He looked back at Delphine. He said, "You have no witness, ambassador. You have paper. You have translation. You have the word of a foreign envoy against the medical judgment of our royal guild." Delphine smiled, just a little. She said, "You are correct. Lord Thal, paper is not enough." She raised her hand again. She said, "Which is why I have brought a witness." She turned toward the side door. She said, "Please enter." The door opened, and Ethara Vaynor, 72 years old, small, white-haired, in a simple robe, walked through it, into the light. I had thought, beforehand, that the hall would gasp, that there would be shouts, that nobles would leap to their feet. I was wrong. The hall went silent. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of a room where 300 people, simultaneous, recognize a ghost. Ethara walked slowly, steadily, to the center of the floor. She stopped beside Elyndra. She placed one thin hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, and she looked out at the hall. She said, in a voice that carried without effort, "I am Ethara Vaynor, widow of Casthar Vaynor, mother of Sylveth Vaynor, grandmother of Elyndra Vaynor, and I have been alive for every one of the 22 years that some of you have believed me dead." An old counselor, in the second row, began to weep. He had known her, long ago, before. Ethara continued. She said, "I was removed from public life 22 years ago, under threat that my daughter would be killed if I refused. I was placed in a convent, under permanent seclusion, by order of the Ashen Conquered." She turned, and she pointed, her thin arm, steady as a spear, straight at Kyaevros Thal. She said, "By order of that man." Kyaevros Thal's face did not change, but something in his hand moved, which I saw, because I was watching him, and because I had been watching him since the moment I entered the hall, waiting for exactly this. His hand moved toward the inside fold of his robe. Every diplomat learns, somewhere in training, that when a powerful man reaches into his own robe in a public moment, very few of the things he might be reaching for are good. I moved before I thought. I moved before instinct. I moved on the trained certainty of a man who had already promised his mother's memory that he would stop. I stepped between Kyaevros and Elyndra. I said loud, sharp, "He has a weapon." The hall erupted. Guards rushed. Nobles scattered. Kyaevros cleared his robe, and in his hand was not a knife, not a small blade. It was something worse, a small silver rod, compact, elegant, the kind of thing wealthy men carried, because they did not want to get their hands dirty. An Aelisari personal disruptor, which at close range was fatal. He raised it, not at Elyndra, not at me, at Ethara, the oldest witness, the most inconvenient one, the one who could end him with a single sworn statement. He raised it, and he pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. He pulled the trigger again. Nothing happened. He looked at the device in his hand, confused. For the first time in perhaps 40 years, confused, behind him, from the guard's cordon, a small figure stepped out. Sarah Vosk, in her plain gray archivist's robes, holding a small round device in her palm. She said, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. Neutralizing pulse, effective within a range of 6 paces. I have been carrying it, in my sleeve, for an hour. She looked at Kavros Thal. She said, I have been waiting 6 years to do this. He turned to her, furious, raising the useless disruptor. Not to fire, to strike. He lunged. Isara did not step back. Guards had already begun to move. But Kavros was fast for a man his age. He swung the disruptor at her head. Isara raised her arm. It struck her shoulder. Hard. She cried out, but she did not fall, because she did not have to fall, because by then the guards were on him. 4 of them, then 6, then 8, wrestling him to the floor, his silver hair loose from its braid, falling into his eyes, his iron face finally, cracking. Han looked up, from the floor, through his own hair, and he found Elyndra with his eyes. He hissed, You are still nothing. She looked down at him. She said, very softly, Then why are you on the floor? And I am standing. Isara sank to her knees. Her shoulder was bleeding. Not badly, but enough. She held it, her small face pale. Thelric was already moving across the hall, kneeling beside her, his old physician's hands. Steady after all these years, steady from a lifetime of practice, beginning to examine. He looked up at me and nodded. She would be fine. I let out the breath I did not know I had been holding. Elyndra crossed to Isara, knelt, took her hand. She said, You saved my grandmother's life. Isara said, Through the pain. I saved my princess's grandmother's life. Elyndra said, You saved my life. Why, Sarah said, I saved all of us. And in the middle of a ruined ceremony, in a hall still ringing with the impact of everything that had just happened, on a stone floor with blood on it and a would-be assassin pinned 3 feet away, Elyndra leaned forward, kissed Isara on the forehead, like a sister, like a mother, like a queen. I do not know how many people in that hall were crying. I know I was. The council did not go home that day. They did not leave the hall. They did not adjourn. They did not recess, because Delphine did what she had been preparing for 6 months. She called for an immediate, fully independent, medical examination of Princess Elyndra Vaynor, conducted on the spot, in front of the council, by physicians selected, randomly, from the neutral houses, with no ties to any faction. The old white-robed counselor, shaken, but recovering, agreed. Because he had to, because the alternative was chaos, because the whole political structure of Elisari had just cracked open, and the only way to hold it together was to let the truth come. The examination took place in a small chamber, off the main hall. Elyndra walked in, alone, 6 physicians, randomly selected, sealed instruments, no opportunity for tampering. I sat in the hall, on a stone bench, beside Ithara. I did not speak. She did not speak. She placed her thin hand over mine, and we sat there, 2 people, waiting for a young woman to walk back into a room and find out whether the life she had been told to accept was a life at all. The wait was 39 minutes. I counted every one of them, because Elisari has no clocks in its ceremonial halls, so you count, in your head, to keep from screaming. At minute 39, the door opened. The lead physician came out first, a woman, middle-aged, silver-eyed, robe still buttoned to the neck. Her expression was, I could not read it. She approached the council. She stopped, cleared her throat. She said, Honored members, I must confer with the ambassador and with the princess herself before I speak to the council. I stood up. Ithara stood up. We crossed the hall together. Ithara, Delphine, Isara supported by Thelric, and me, into the small chamber. Elyndra was seated on the exam table, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me. Her eyes were wide. She said, Corvan. I said, yes. The physician cleared her throat. Then she said, slowly, carefully, as if she were still trying to make sense of the words herself. She said, the princess is not barren. The room went very quiet. The physician said, there is no medical basis, present or past, for that diagnosis. She is entirely healthy, perfectly, beautifully, ordinarily healthy. Elyndra let out a breath, a long, slow, shaking breath. 6 years of a breath she had not been able to release. Ithara made a small sound and put her hand over her mouth. But the physician was not done. She said, there is, however, something else that I must report. She looked at Elyndra. She said, Princess. Elyndra said, yes. The physician said, you are with child. The room stopped moving. I remember very clearly that the light coming through the small chamber window went very still, as if the sun itself had paused. Elyndra looked up at me, her face white, her mouth open. She said, that is not possible. The physician said, it is early, but it is confirmed. The examination was thorough. She said, you are approximately 5 weeks. Elyndra said, I am. The physician said, pregnant. I could not breathe. The physician cleared her throat again. She said, Princess, I must add, this is unprecedented. In our medical history, interspecies compatibility between our people and humans has never been formally documented before. She paused. She said, yet here it is, undeniable, confirmed, through direct examination. Elyndra looked at me. Her eyes. I do not have words for her eyes. In that moment, she reached out, and I crossed to her, and she pulled me into her arms, and she began to cry, in a way I had never heard her cry. Not the storm night crying, not the greenhouse crying, not the mountain crying. This was different. This was the crying of a woman, 24 years old, who had spent 6 years believing she would never hold her own child, and who had just been told she was already carrying one. I held her. I could not speak. I could only hold her. Ithara sat down, very slowly, in a small chair by the wall, and pressed both hands to her face. She whispered, Sylveth. Oh, Sylveth. Did you know? Did you know all along? We walked back into the main hall together. Elyndra, in the center, her hand in mine, her hair falling loose down her back, her cheeks wet, but her spine straight. Ithara on her other side, one thin arm linked through her granddaughter's. The council was still there, every seat still full, every eye still fixed on the door we came through. The physician walked ahead of us, onto the raised dais. She spoke, clear, calm, loud enough that every noble in every tiered row heard every word. She confirmed, Princess Elyndra Vaynor, not Barren. She confirmed, no medical basis for the previous declaration. She confirmed, falsified documentation, signed under coercion. She confirmed, the princess, pregnant. She confirmed, the first successful interspecies conception. In Aelisari's recorded history, there was silence. And then, slowly, somewhere in the back of the hall, a single person began to clap, then another, then another. By the time the sound reached the front of the hall, it was thunder, a whole cathedral of stone, applauding, some in shock, some in relief, some in genuine joy, some in political recalculation. All of them, at once. Elyndra stood in the middle of it, her hand still in mine, her grandmother still at her side. She lifted her chin, she looked out at the whole hall, and she did not shake. She did not lower her eyes. She did not apologize for existing. She looked like a queen, because she was one. The trials that followed were not quick. Aelisari does justice slowly, deliberately, in front of the whole empire, not in shadows, not in back rooms, not with quiet, convenient deaths. Kaievros Thal was tried in open court for 6 months. Every crime laid out, every witness heard, every document read into the record. Sylvith's murder, Ithara's imprisonment, Elyndra's false diagnosis. 2 decades of political manipulation, multiple assassination attempts, the reassignments and deaths of 9 physicians, the corruption of the Royal Medical Guild, the theft and suppression of the Northern Archive, which Ithara herself testified about, which Elyndra herself read from in open court, about a visitor who had crashed on their world 30 years before formal contact, whose knowledge had been protected by 2 generations of Vaynor women, whose legacy the conquered had tried to seize and control. Kaievros was found guilty. On every count, he was stripped of his title, his lands, his name, his voice in politics. Permanently, he was sentenced to exile, not death, because the new law under Elyndra's reign would not create martyrs, would not spill blood in the shadows the way his people had. He would live out his life on a small monitored island, under permanent watch, writing his memoirs if he chose, in a room without windows, which, when you have spent your whole life at the center of power, is a punishment worse than any blade. Thelric Ombron was called to testify. He stood in front of the whole court, his old hands shaking, his voice thin. He told the truth, all of it, his signature. 6 years ago, under threat to his children, his guilt, his secrecy, his failure to test the tea. 18 years ago, that would have saved a queen. At the end of his testimony, he looked at the panel of judges, and he said, "I do not ask for mercy. I ask only for the record to show that I was wrong, that I knew I was wrong, and that I have been trying, in whatever ways were left to me, to make it right." The judges consulted. They said, Dr. Thelric Ombron had provided the primary evidence against the Ashen Conquered. His testimony had been essential. His remorse was demonstrable. His years of guilt were themselves a form of sentence. He would not be imprisoned. He would, instead, continue his practice, on the condition that he would spend the rest of his career teaching young physicians about what had happened, so that no future generation would ever again sign a document under coercion, and spend 6 years hoping the pain would ease. Thelric wept. He did not stop weeping for a long time. Elyndra crossed the hall, in front of everyone, and she put her hand on his shoulder. She said, loud enough for the record to catch, "Dr. Ombron, you were a victim, too. Welcome home." Ysera Vosk received a title. She did not want one. She protested, loudly. To Elyndra, in private, she said, "I am an archivist. Princess, I like books. I like paper. I do not like ceremonies." Elyndra said, "You are the woman who saved my grandmother's life." Ysera said, "I am the woman who liked her job. I would like to keep liking my job." Elyndra laughed. It was one of the first true laughs I ever heard from her. She said, "Then you shall have a title and a job, together, head archivist of the royal records, with authority to reorganize anything you wish and prosecute anyone who tries to falsify a document ever again." Ysera considered this. She said, "That, actually, sounds acceptable." Ithara returned to the palace. She was given her old wing back, which she said was too large and too gaudy and smelled of lies. She had it stripped down, simplified, filled it with plants and books, and a large sunny window where she could sit and do embroidery and receive her granddaughter every afternoon for tea. The empire wanted to give her honors, public ceremonies, reparations, statues. She refused most of them. She said, "I have already been given the only thing I wanted, which was to come home." She spent a great deal of time with Elyndra, teaching her about the family history that had been hidden from her, about her mother's laugh, about her grandfather's temper, about the small daily rituals of the Vaynor women. That had been lost and could be rebuilt. She spent a great deal of time with me. She would sit with me in the garden, some evenings, long after Elyndra had gone in to rest. and she would ask me questions about Earth, about my mother, about the small human oddities that fascinated her. She said humans laugh too loudly, and apologize too often, and love too clumsily. She said she had come to love us, for all three reasons. The baby grew. Elyndra's belly grew round beneath her formal robes. She refused to hide it. She wore lighter colors, softer robes, loose belts. Sometimes she went to public sessions of the council with her hand resting openly on the curve of her body. The nobles who had once looked past her now bowed to her. She acknowledged them with a small nod, nothing more, because she had learned, very quickly, that the same people who had ignored her for 6 years would grovel for 6 years now, given the chance. She did not grovel back. She did not punish them either. She simply moved forward, steady, warm, certain she was becoming, right in front of my eyes, the queen her mother had known she would be. 9 months after the ceremony, on a warm morning, both suns bright, Elyndra went into labor. The medical team was ready. Aelisari physicians and human physicians, working side by side. Delphine had arranged for two of Earth's best obstetricians to travel to Aelisari as advisors. They arrived with practiced calm and a look, in their eyes, of women who understood they were part of something. That had never happened before. Ithara was in the room. Isara was in the room. Thelric was in the room. Delphine was in the room. I was in the room. I held Elyndra's hand for every hour of it. I whispered the names of the streets in Denver because she had asked me to. Weeks before, when she was practicing for what she called the hardest thing, she had said, "Corvan, when it is happening, tell me about your home, every corner of it, so I do not think about the pain." So I did, for hours. I told her about the alley behind my grandfather's house, about the smell of pine needles in December, about the way the aspen leaves turn gold in October, about the way my mother used to hum. When she thought no one was listening, Elyndra breathed through it all. She did not scream. She did not cry. She squeezed my hand, so tight, that my fingers were bruised for a week afterwards. And then, just as the first sun was rising, there was a cry, small, sharp, human. And Aelisari, because our daughter, was both. They laid her on Elyndra's chest, small, wet, pink, impossibly small, a wisp of gold hair on her head, the very faint pale luminescence in her skin that all Aelisari children have, but the shape of her face, the curve of her ear, the shape of her fingers, ours, both of ours. Elyndra looked at her, and then up at me, and she said, in a voice I have never heard before or since, she said, "Corvan, she is here." I said, "She is here." She said, "Nira. Her name is Nira." I had not known that was to be the name, but the moment she said it, it was correct. It fit, in the way names sometimes fit, only after they have been spoken. Ithara came to the bedside, slowly, her old hand shaking. Elyndra held out the baby. She said, "Grandmother." Ithara sat down, because her knees would not hold her. She took the child, very gently, cradled her against her chest. She looked down at the baby. She said, "Little bird, you will not know any of the things they tried to do to us." She looked up at Elyndra. She said, "You did that." She looked at me. She said, "You both did that." Then she looked down at the baby again, and she said, very softly, as if she were speaking to someone across a great distance, she said, "Sylveth, look at what your daughter did." I do not know what Sylveth saw, from wherever she was, if she was anywhere, but I know that I felt her in that room, just for a moment, and I know that every person in that room felt her too, because the whole space went very still, and very warm, and very quiet. And then Nira, our daughter, opened her eyes. They were pale blue, ice just before it breaks, her mother's eyes. Time began to move differently after that. Not slower, not faster, just kinder. Nira grew. She was a bright child, curious, endlessly loud in a way Elisari children were not, which Ithara found endlessly amusing. She said that she had at last, in her 73rd year, met a Vaynor with a real laugh. Elyndra took the throne 2 years after Nera's birth, in a coronation that was small, simple, full of quiet joy. She reigned differently than any Vaynor before her. She reformed the medical guild. She strengthened the archives. She opened diplomatic channels not just to Earth, but to a dozen other worlds. She refused to build her reign on bloodline alone. She built it on truth, on accountability, on the slow, patient work of never lying to a young woman about her own body ever again. Under her reign, the Ashen Concord did not just fall. It became a word children used when they wanted to describe a bad thing, a whispered thing, a thing their grandmothers had lived through and promised would never come again. Ithara lived to see Nera turn 10 years old. She died on a warm afternoon, in her sunny window, with her embroidery in her lap and her tea beside her. Elyndra was with her. Her last words were, "Little bird, I am so proud of you." She was buried in her own garden, under the rose bushes she had grown at the convent, which Elyndra had transplanted to the palace years before. The whole empire mourned her, but the mourning was not sad in the way funerals usually are. It was full, rich, warm, the mourning of a woman who had lived long enough to see all of her wounds healed before she went, which is the best any of us can ask for. Thelric Ombron taught for 15 more years. Every physician who trained on Elisari during those years passed through his classroom and learned the lesson of the coerced signature, the lesson of the 6 years of guilt, the lesson of what it means to be forgiven by the person you have wronged. He died at 83, peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by his 3 children and his wife, and a room full of physicians who had been his students. Why Sarah Vosk, head archivist, never left her records. She married a botanist, late in life, had no children of her own, but adopted every young archivist she trained, as if they were. She lived to be very old. The truth of Elisari's history, as we know it today, is her doing. She kept the receipts. Delphine Marsh retired from the ambassadorship. 10 years after the ceremony, she returned to Earth, where she wrote a memoir about her years on Elisari. It became, for a time, required reading in every diplomatic academy in the galactic community. She and Elyndra remained close until the end of her life. Delphine died in her small house, outside a small American city, with a photograph of Elyndra and Nera framed on her nightstand. She had told me once, toward the end, that out of all her students, I was the one who had reminded her why she had done any of this in the first place. I did not have words for her then. I do not have words for her now, but I miss her. Still, and me, Corvan Reeve, small, loud, once a junior liaison officer, I stayed. I stayed for the rest of my life. I never returned to Earth to live, only to visit, to see cousins, to lay flowers at my mother's grave, to stand for a moment at the porch, where a 7-year-old boy had once been told, "When you see someone being treated like nothing, you stop." I stopped. I stopped and I stayed. And I built a life in a palace, on a planet, under 2 moons, with a golden-haired queen, and a daughter with pale blue eyes, and a growing garden of small, quiet miracles. I was called many things over the years: consort, prince, husband of Elyndra, father of Nera, guardian of the truth, but the name I loved best was the one Elyndra used, in private, in the small warm room where she read to Nera before bed. She would look up from the book, at me sitting in the doorway watching them, and she would say, "Come here, my Corvan." Many years later, after Nera had grown and gone into her own life, traveling between worlds, speaking 3 languages, loving whoever she chose, answering to no one, after the palace had settled into a quieter shape, under a queen who had lived long enough to make her reforms permanent, after Ethara had gone, after Delphine had gone, after Thelric had gone. Elyndra and I sat on the balcony, the same balcony where, long ago, she had first told me about the letters from her mother, about the 12 years of preparing for the far stars. She was 50 years old that night. Her gold hair was streaked with silver now, which I found more beautiful than the gold had ever been, because it was hers, because she had earned every strand of it. She put her head on my shoulder. She said, "Corvan," I said. "Yes." She said, "Do you remember the very first thing you said to me?" I said, "Hello." She said, "That was it, wasn't it? That was the whole thing." I said, "That was the whole thing." She said, "That one word broke 6 years of silence." I said, "Baum, that one word broke 6 years of silence." She said, "And started the rest of my life." I said, "Baum, started ours." She lifted my hand to her mouth, and she kissed my palm, slowly, once. And the twin moons rose, silver and pink, as they had every night, for as long as I had known this world. And I thought about my mother on the porch, when I was 7, telling a small boy that someday he would meet a person being treated like nothing, and he would have a choice. I thought about Sylveth, reaching across 18 years of death with letters written in a language her daughter had not yet learned, trusting that the truth would find a way. I thought about Ethara, tending roses on a mountain, waiting patiently for 22 years, for the day someone would come. I thought about Isara, standing very small, in front of a very large man, with a device in her palm. I thought about Thelric, kneeling on a greenhouse floor, being forgiven. I thought about every woman, in every hall, in every century, who had been told she was broken, by people who benefited from the breaking. And I want to say this, now, while I am still here to say it, if you have ever been made to feel that your value was measured by something your body could or could not do, if you have ever been told that you were finished by people who never bothered to look at you properly, if you have ever sat in a room where everyone spoke around you as if you were already a memory, you are not that. You have never been that. You are Elyndra, standing in the hall, refusing to shake. You are Ethara, tending your roses, waiting patiently. You are Sylveth, writing letters to a future you would not live to see. You are Ysera, small and fierce with a device in your sleeve. You are every woman who ever stopped for someone else in some quiet moment nobody saw. And I promise you, the universe notices. Some stories are not written in blood, not in conquest, not in the loud declarations of powerful men. Some stories are written quietly, by a young woman standing in a hall alone, refusing to lower her eyes, by an old woman tending roses on a mountain, waiting for a name to be spoken, by a doctor who could not live with what he had signed, by a small archivist with a device in her sleeve, by a mother long dead reaching across time with letters, by a boy on a porch, being told to stop. Those are the stories that change everything. That night on the balcony, Elyndra kissed my palm again, and she said, very softly, "Thank you. Thank you, and for saying hello," I said. "Thank you for answering." And the 2 moons rose higher, silver and pink, over a world neither of us had been born to, but which had become ours anyway, because we had stopped, because we had answered, because we had chosen each other. And that, in the end,